The KWM-2 and the KWM-2A were by far the most popular transceiver that Collins ever produced. It was utilized by both the hams and the military users, introduced in 1959 and was produced for over 25 years, at least into the mid-80s. More than 25,000 units were produced. These are quite collectible now, and a lot of people like to get their hands on a KWM-2 for the shack. Plate input power is 175 watts on single sideband, 160 watts on CW. This unit was priced at $1,150 at introduction in 1959, and they really tried to hold that price up through the mid-60s. You really had to throw in another 300 or so bucks for the noise blanker option, the microphone, the power supply, the other accessories, and so on. So we're really talking about a pretty expensive radio. Of course, it handles 80 through 10 meters in 5 bands, but you can substitute any 200 kilohertz range from 3.4 to 30 megahertz, except in a small range between 5 and 6.5 megahertz, using an appropriate crystal. The radio is ready for military use in depots and in the field, and it works up to 10,000 feet and will take 2 Gs of truck vibration between 10 and 33 hertz. So think about how much $1,250 or $1,150 was in 1965. It's close to $10,000 today. And remember, in 65, you get a brand new Mustang for $2,427. So those hams that could not afford such a beast as a KWM-2 were affectionately known as peasants. The RF system in the KWM-2 is a double conversion super heterodyne type, where both the receiver and the transmitter are using much the same circuits. The transmitter and receiver circuits use common oscillators, a common mechanical filter, common RF amplifier. The transmitter low-frequency IF and the receiver low-frequency IF are both 455 kilohertz, very standard. The high-frequency IF for both is 2.955 to 3.155 megahertz. And there's a bandpass first IF, which accommodates the full 200 kilohertz tuning bandwidth. The mechanical filter, which provides the channel selectivity, is in the second IF, or the 455 kilohertz IF. So with the crystal deck, the radio can accommodate any 200 kilohertz segment, with the exception of that small band we talked about. So I'm going to refer to this switched crystal first conversion oscillator with a fixed range tunable second IF oscillator. I'm going to refer to this scheme as the Collins dual conversion system from now on in the video. Okay, Collins collectors, can you ever forgive me for that outburst? Really, the KWM-2 with its introduction in 1959 and popularity becomes the gold standard. And it is high price, though. There's no doubt about it. If you want top of the line and the highest quality, you're going to pay for it. But this left a lot of room for the other manufacturers to come in with lower cost products. And as you're going to see, there are plenty of KWM-2 knockoffs that are going to show up. But before we get into that area, let's go into the very low-end, entry-level kit-type transceiver that became popular when Heathkit introduced the HW series. These little monobanders are really interesting radios. And we'll go through the radios one at a time. I'm not going to cover everything exhaustively, but we'll go through about 10 different transceivers that were very popular in the early to mid-60s. These represent the the pinnacle of analog tube technology before the hybrid idea really hit in the late 60s and early 70s. So when Heathkit announced the Hot Water 12, 22, and 32 single bander transceivers, it was a big deal because suddenly a full single sideband transceiver could be in your hands for very short money, and these were fun little kits. As a matter of fact, my Elmer, towards the end of his life, he actually assembled one just as a project. You know, assembling Heathkits is a lot of fun. Maybe the circuitry isn't the state of the art, but just working on Heathkits and any kind of kit like that was therapy in itself. So the three Heathkit monobanders together would allow you to cover 75 meters, 40 meters, or 20 meters, strictly in the phone portion of the band, the general phone portion of the band, only 200 kilohertz. And you can imagine that at $104, that's less than 1/10 of the cost of the KWM-2. And this got you on the air with single sideband, which at the time was still a fairly new mode. There were a lot of people still running AM in 1965. So here was a radio that could also go in the car. It's ready-made for mobile service. One little tidbit, the KWM-2 made by Collins is a mobile rig. Any serious person using a base station, of course, would be running the S line. The radios themselves are quite interesting in that they utilize the simplest architecture. The architecture of a single conversion transceiver is simply a VFO and a carrier oscillator and shared crystal filter. The crystal filter itself, operating at a higher frequency than 455 kilohertz, is an interesting story. Of course, Collins with the KWM-2 wanted to take advantage of two of its trademarked and patented devices. That is the mechanical filter, which really is only practical at low frequencies, and the permeability tuned oscillator, or the PTO. They were so enamored with the PTO that they trademarked it, and other manufacturers could not use the term permeability tuned oscillator or PTO. So you'll see a lot of these transceivers that we're going to go over use PTOs, but they don't call them PTOs. They'll call them linear master oscillators, or slug-tuned oscillators, or variable inductance oscillators, or something like that. Well, sharp looking on the outside, and really the inside. What's not to love about the Eico 753? Really beautifully done kit transceiver, very nicely done manual. Looks good from every angle, but a little more work to wire this than the normal hot water. You're going to have to be pretty skilled to build something like this, and as you can see, it's quite complex underneath. But just a wonderful rig for the money, giving you 3 bands, 200 watts PEP, and it utilizes the very advanced 7360 balanced modulator, just like a KWM-2. It's single conversion like the Hot Water 12, but it uses a 4-pole filtered IF, the crystal filter at 5.2 megahertz. 2 VFO ranges are employed, 8.7 to 9.2 megahertz for the 80 and 20 meter bands, and 12.2 to 12.5 megahertz for the 40 meter band. Both image rejection and channel selectivity and probably sensitivity would be better than the Hot Water series, and you got all 3 bands. Full band coverage, CW, and AM operation. Unfortunately, the high-frequency switched VFO is the Achilles heel of the 753, hence the nickname, the 7drifty3. Best to let this one warm up, folks, but what's not to love for 200 watts and 179.95 in kit form. Well, we're talking about the NCX3, and this is close to home because this was my first transceiver, the NCX3, and it came along right after I got my first car, which was a 66 Bel Air. The 66 Bel Air came from a grandma. This is a real grandma car. It was already 10 years old when I got it. Not quite 10 years old, but it only had 19,000 miles on it. So it didn't look much different than this, that's for sure. It was almost a brand new car. It had been garaged. And the NCX3 fit nicely in the 66 Bel Air and left room for passengers and such. No impact whatsoever on the room inside this car. The NCX3 was a single conversion transceiver with a 5.2 megahertz 4-pole crystal lattice filter and a tube VFO. That VFO has some drift issues, but it's usually good when it's warmed up. The VFO is a regulated, well-designed electron-coupled oscillator, but they sure are asking a lot from this VFO at these high frequencies. The radio was noted for its talk power and has a very hot receiver. Well-designed single conversion receivers with good filters really give good performance, sometimes lower noise than any of those dual or triple conversion type receivers. On 80 and 75, 20 meters, the VFO tunes between 8.68 and 9.22 megahertz. This gives a tuning range of 3.480 to 4.020 megahertz. This is high side or subtractive mixing. The radio tunes from 13.88 to 14.420 on 20 using low side mixing with the 5.2 IF. On 40 meters, the VFO tunes between 12.180 and 12.510. This gives a tuning range of 6.980 to 7.31 megahertz. So this is high side or subtractive mixing. I hated, however, that it did not have a CW side tone. I used to use the AM radio in the Chevy as kind of a poor man's side tone when I was trying to do CW in the car. CW in the car? Who does CW in the car? I also hated the system relay. It was a beautiful plug-in relay, but high voltage, and they were asking the triode section of a 6GH8 to drive the relay. So there's a tube that had to be replaced quite often. Again, the sweep tube situation, 6GJ6s, 6GJ5 sweep tubes, they were considered old-fashioned by 1965. But those are very rugged tubes, and they're still pretty cheap. So now we get into the first of the 5-band transceivers that are aimed at the lower cost market. And the Galaxy 5 is kind of an ugly duckling of transceivers and doesn't seem to hold the value that some of these vintage rigs do. But I will assure you, this is one of the most sophisticated transceivers ever designed at that time. This is very compact for the time and really designed for mobile operation in some of those larger cars in the early 60s. Plus it was running the latest sweep tubes. Power War was definitely on at this time. This is the first of the full 5-band radios with a reasonable price tag. And I think that by using a standard 9 megahertz filter, this is one of the first radios to use a standard 9 megahertz filter, and a standard 5 to 5.5 megahertz VFO. Unlike the other radios, this uses a heterodyne VFO, so the VFO always tunes between 5 and 5.5 megahertz, and a series of crystals puts it into the right band segment to work with that 9 megahertz IF. It also has switchable upper and lower sideband on the carrier oscillator. So it's quite a very clever system for a single conversion. And Leo Meyerson and World Radio Labs has to be commended on the Galaxy 5. Were hams ready for a radio of the 1970s in 1963? Well, Faust Gonset had originally tried to get into the game with a larger radio called the GC-102 back in the late 50s. But the radio was decidedly large and ugly, and consequently not too many were sold. It's a fairly rare beast. So Gonset really missed the game up until 1963 when they came out with the SB-33. Faust formed sideband engineers, and this first offering was a leap over everything we've discussed thus far. A fully hybrid transceiver with 90% solid state, unfortunately using germanium RF transistors throughout. However, he used the Collins mechanical filter and a new concept in engineering called bilateral stages. Bilateral stages are stages that can work forward or backward equally. And the radio is based on this concept, which is quite modern. The radio is also extremely lightweight at only 15 pounds and with a built-in 120-volt AC power supply. The government took notice of such an advanced radio. Raytheon actually became a distributor for overseas sales. The radio might have been a bridge too far for a lot of hams. Limited to 4 bands, single sideband only, so not that popular and very collectible. Beyond using the triple conversion simply to take advantage of the Collins mechanical filter, the bidirectional mixer and RF amplifier design in this radio are quite novel for the time. If you'd like to learn more about that, pick up Experimental Methods in RF Design by Wes Hayward, Rick Campbell, and Bob Larkin. Well, challengers were due to come along to go against the Collins KWM-2 transceiver. And one of the ones that arrived on the scene in 1965 was the Heathkit SB-100. Now, this is a full dual conversion transceiver. It's got a linear master oscillator, which is very similar to the PTO in the Collins. It uses a crystal filter at 3.395 megahertz, almost 3.4 megahertz. And actually it has 3 separate oscillators. It has a bank of crystal oscillators that basically are your band switching heterodyne crystals, then the linear master oscillator, and finally your BFO carrier oscillator. So there's actually a first and a second mixer, both in the receiver and in the transmitter. The set has some innovations in it. For instance, it has a full ring balanced modulator made with diodes rather than the tube type balanced modulators of the earlier rigs, and uses the very popular 6146A tubes. Is also known as the poor man's Collins. It has all of the features that the Collins has. It's a full dual conversion heterodyne switching transceiver, and it's got a few more controls on the front that make it a little more friendly for ham radio operation. It operates on 500 kilohertz bands, but basically gives you full band coverage from 80 meters all the way to 10. It actually covers 10 meters in 4 separate 500 kilohertz bands. There's also a little auxiliary crystal oscillator so that you can use it on nets on a known crystal frequency. Holy cow, the Swan 350. How many of you got DX Century Club with this baby? 400 watts PEP in a single conversion transceiver. Swan takes single conversion to the absolute extreme, at the risk of a little bit of drift, hence the nickname, the Drifty 350. So I'm reading directly from QST, September 1965, and this is the recent equipment review of the Swan 350. The engineers at Swan have taken a different approach. The VFO's frequency range is changed for each band, so only one frequency conversion is required. The single sideband generator in the 350 is at 5 MHz, and its output is mixed with the output of the VFO to produce the operating frequency. Sounds pretty simple, but severe requirements are placed on that VFO. It must be stable on rather high frequencies, have a series of frequency ranges, each of which must be temperature compensated, and cover 500 kHz increments in each range, so the calibration remains the same regardless of the band selected. However, the difficulties in building such a VFO for the job are more than offset by the simplicity and reduction in costs that can be obtained with single conversion. The VFO itself is made up of a pair of 2N706 transistors. One is the oscillator itself, which is a grounded-based Colpitts oscillator. This is a very stable form of bipolar oscillator, and a 2N706 as a buffer. And then that goes into a tube that acts as the isolation amplifier to provide the injection into the two mixers. VFO drift during warm-up is about 1 kHz on 80, 40, and 20 meters, and about 2 kHz on 15 and 10. After warm-up, the drift rate is very slow. These drift figures are not as good as some of the multi-conversion rigs that use the Collins system, but are certainly acceptable for normal operating. Well, you can be the judge of that. I can remember chasing plenty of friends up and down the band using their 350s. When Drake wanted to get into the single sideband transceiver game, they went in full blast. If you look at a TR3, you see this copper-plated chassis, and it's really something to behold. And they did it with a single conversion design. It's much like a Galaxy with the 9 MHz IF, and tuning 600 kHz bands with the VFO tuning from 4.9 to 5.5 MHz, and then using the heterodyne method. So it's a very souped up single conversion transceiver. And they're using 3 sweep tubes in the final. If 2 are good, 3 might be better. So a full 300 watts PEP, and the thing does a commendable job on AM as well with a screen modulator. Quite an impressive transceiver, and not a Collins clone at all, but more of a Galaxy. Or did the Galaxy clone the TR3, since the TR3 came out quite early? So of course I have not operated all of these radios or owned all of these radios. I've owned a few of them, and I've operated a few of them. I remember TR3, for instance. I was a novice at the time, and we were operating at field day. A pair of novices taking turns with a TR3 on CW. Now, a TR3 on CW with no side tone is tricky, but they had hooked up some kind of a beeper, you know, that worked with some paddles, and they hooked it up to a regular straight key, and we were able to operate the novice station on CW with the TR3, and it worked just fine. So other radios I have owned, like the SR-150, which is just a wonderful Hallicrafters transceiver. I even use that thing on some digital modes. It's stable enough for PSK31, apparently. So as the ad went, feel like a little larceny? Go ahead, take advantage of us. At only $685, National's NCX5 transceiver is a real steal. Let me tell you, this looks like a pretty nice transceiver. The styling alone and the aluminum looks pretty sharp, and it's very rugged inside and out. This is a well-designed transceiver. 5-band, high performance, and it really gives you a good performance on sideband because it has a 8-pole crystal filter instead of a 4-pole like most of the other rigs we've been talking about that use crystal filters. Also, the digital readout feature with the counter dial, much like the R390A, the Collins, it makes this transceiver a standout in its day. And this would be the outright winner, I think. If they'd done a little bit more on the front panel to give you a few more controls, So the NCX5 transceiver designed to cover 80 through 10, and it combines the double conversion super heterodyne receiver and single sideband transmitter. They both employ a common crystal lattice filter, and it's an 8-pole filter, so that's a little bit better than what we've seen in some of the other radios. It uses a pi network in the final, and it's just a beautifully designed Collins style with the switching crystal front end with a tunable IF, and the VFO is solid state. It's got a lot going for it. A really well-designed, rugged transceiver. Number 1, the top transceiver of the Big Ten. It's a tie. I couldn't make up my mind on these two last radios. The Hallicrafters SR-150 and the Drake TR-4. What a pair. The Hallicrafters, another Collins clone, and the Drake takes single conversion to the absolute maximum. So the Hallicrafters SR-150 transceiver consists of a double conversion receiver and a double conversion transmitter. So it essentially is the Collins system. VFO circuitry, the heterodyne crystal oscillator circuitry, and the crystal IF circuitry are common to both the transmitter and the receiver. And this transceiver is actually quite early in the game. So this probably is the first Collins clone transceiver. Hallicrafters probably wins the game and gets the SR-150 on the market pretty rapidly. But the price of the 150 is quite high, so it still leaves a lot of room for those other transceivers that we've already covered. So the transceiver basically uses the crystal heterodyne system on the front end, and it ends up with a tunable IF of 6 MHz to 6.5 MHz. And then the RF amplifier and mixer tune circuits are selected by the band selector. That variable IF signal is amplified by a tunable IF amplifier that's mixed with the signal from the VFO. And the resulting second IF signal is 1.650 MHz. The signal is amplified by the IF circuits in both the transmitter and the receiver. So it's essentially a dual conversion receiver, dual conversion transmitter, with the VFO operating as a tunable IF system. The Drake TR-4 is quite a transceiver. It's basically everything that a TR-3 can do, and it brings in a solid-state VFO with linear permeability tuning. So it's a very stable VFO on the radio. It still uses the single conversion heterodyne architecture, which is absolutely amazing. It brings in a CW sidetone oscillator, which is really needed on some of these old rigs, and automatic transmit-receive switching on CW, which is just a super convenience. So this guy has decent AM performance as well, real diode detector on AM, and it just seems to be the best of the 1965 offerings. I would have made this one the sole winner if it wasn't for the competition of the NCX5, and the SR-150 is such a classic rig. So isn't the TR-4 just a better version of the TR-3? Yeah, looking at the block diagram, it really is. You get the solid state VFO, of course, permeability tuning. And you've got the CW sidetone, which is a big deal if you love to work CW. And it fixes a few other things and makes the transceiver really something pretty special. And they continued to innovate on the TR-4 up through the 70s. Okay, please remain seated. I might have missed your favorite rig or misrepresented one of these transceivers. Maybe you disagreed with some of the choices, but just trying to present the early years of the single sideband transceivers, really between 1959 and 1965. And you have to realize that many of these radios went through many runs, many versions, and a lot of the warts of the early rigs were cleaned up in subsequent years. Some of them lived on well into the mid-70s, by the way, and longer. And some radios were just introduced in 1965, so they maybe didn't have the features that that you know about, that you have in your later model radio. So I hope you enjoyed this little review of the top 10 transceivers of the early 60s. I had to cut it off around 1965. I know that around 1965 there was a lot going on, and some of these radios represent the end of their runs, and some would be modified and continue to live on to the 70s and even the 80s. But in 65, single sideband was beginning to be mainstream in ham radio, and these transceivers are what got us there. Now, are they going to have the same performance as modern transceivers? Probably not, but the nostalgia factor alone is worth restoring one of these guys. So the journey is what it's all about with these, putting them back on the air and getting them back in operating condition in the shack. Hope you enjoyed this video. So also I wanted to thank all of the people that put these pictures up on the internet. I shamelessly stole from sites like RigPix and so on to get some pictures of each of the transceivers that we've gone over. I've done some improvements on some of the literature so that's more readable, and if I had to cite all of the sources that I got all this material from, it would be longer than the video itself, but I just wanted to say thanks to all you guys.